In this video, I'll be throwing and trimming some porcelain jars. It's been about 6 years since I last used it, which is far too long. If you happen to watch one of my latest videos about glaze testing, you'll have seen that I was looking for some glazes that would work on porcelain, and I found some. So, these will be the first actual pots coated with them, and with any luck I should see some results in the next couple of weeks. This whole process of using porcelain again, after such a long time away from it, has really made me feel like a beginner. It's just so unbelievably different as compared to the stoneware that I normally use. Even wedging is strange. It's quite a thixotropic material. Before I began wedging this lump, it was really quite firm, but after a couple of folds and spirals, it really loosens up and becomes far more soft. It's also as smooth as butter, unlike the stoneware I use, which contains quite a lot of grog, which is what we call the small particles mixed into the clay body that make it coarse and textured. Once fully wedged up, I can separate the porcelain into individual lumps. These will be thrown into the bodies of the jars, and because porcelain shrinks more than stoneware does, I've had to increase the dimensions I throw the pots to, as well as the weight they're made with, which can be a bit tricky. The stoneware body I normally use shrinks about 12% from freshly thrown to glaze fired, whereas this porcelain clay, which is the Audrey Blackman mix, shrinks about 17%, which means you end up throwing everything almost comically large to compensate for how much it's going to shrink. For all the porcelain pieces I've been making, I've been throwing them on bats. I won't be lifting them away like I do with stoneware pieces, just with my bare hands. Because this is my first time using it in such a long time, I want to be as careful as I can. Once I see some of these porcelain pots fired, it'll inform my making somewhat. I cone the clay up and down numerous times, as it feels like it makes the porcelain feel like it flows beneath my hands more smoothly. It's a process that forces the clay particles, the platelets, to align with each other, and I feel like with porcelain, as it's so unforgiving, that I'll really cone it much more than I might a lump of stoneware clay. I then open it out, and then I spend considerably more time compressing the base, as without doing so, porcelain is quite prone to cracking on the base as it dries, although compressing the base isn't the only thing that's going to help prevent it. Thoroughly coning the clay helps, as does making sure you don't leave any water inside the piece after it's been thrown. To pull the clay up, I'm pinching it at the bottom between a knuckle on the outside and pads of my fingers on the inside. And now for perhaps the most crucial bit of advice for when working with porcelain, and that's to use slip when throwing, as opposed to just using water. Water is either absorbed very quickly, or it simply just runs off the porcelain, leaving you with very little prolonged lubrication. Whereas, if you cover the piece with slip, which is just a mixture of porcelain and water of a cream-like consistency, then this really clings to the surface, and it makes pulling up the walls and shaping the pot far easier. You should see the difference it makes when pulling handles too. It's an almost impossible task to do with just water, as I learnt the hard way, but as soon as I switched to slip, the whole process just clicked and worked. Once the pot has been thrown to the correct height, I mop out all of the water from inside the vessel, as if it's left in there overnight, it can disintegrate the base. Then I cut away the skirt of clay using an old blunted trimming tool. And then I take a flat-edged metal kidney and both shape the pot and remove all the excess slip from the outside of the pot. My aim here is to make the piece as straight as possible, but I don't worry too much as I am going to be altering the top. I find that with the slip removed, the walls have a bit more strength, which they'll need for when I indent the top to form the gallery. I drip a bit more slip over the rim, and then I press my index finger into it which creates a step in the form. It's this internal diameter which is important, and when I'm throwing a batch of jars, I'll throw all of the bodies, these lower sections, so that that diameter is exactly the same. And then when it comes to making the lids, all I have to do is throw them so their locating flange fits perfectly within this diameter. And if anything, I'll make that diameter a bit bigger than needs be when making my lids. That way I can always trim them down to fit perfectly, as opposed to attempting to throw them 100% accurately. In reality, I'd rather just throw them a little bigger than needs be and then spend the 2 seconds it takes to trim them back to fit just right, as opposed to potentially being in a situation where you throw a batch of lids that are all just slightly too small. And with porcelain especially, it's much easier to subtract material than it is to add it. I then tidy off the bat and its edge, and quickly just define this indent at the top. And finally, I just soften the lip of the jar with a chamois leather. I lift my throwing gauge out of the way so that I can easily position my wire behind the vessel and then slide it all the way underneath, separating it from the wooden bat. I then carefully prise the piece off and set it aside with the others. That made it all look a bit too easy, but rest assured there were some failures along the way. Pieces that were either too thin, or the clay was too soft, or I made some simple mistake. It certainly did take some time to get used to it, and I have many more months of practice ahead of me, as hopefully I'll be making more and more porcelain pieces as time goes by. I then take the measurement I had with my calipers and I invert them, whilst also giving myself an extra millimetre or so, which is the wiggle room I was speaking about earlier. The lids themselves are an altogether more simple object to make. I take a soft lump and centre it quickly, forcing it into a shape that's low and wide and with a flat top. I then make a hollow in the middle and open it out slightly, leaving walls on either side that are quite thick. I compress the interior, and then with my middle finger I divide the thick wall into 2 portions. The vertical wall will be the one that fits inside the jar, whereas this horizontal plane will sit above it, resting on the lip of the indented form. I then quickly check this with my pair of calipers, and I find these days I can basically do this without double checking. And by I suppose that's what happens after throwing thousands of jars over the years. I then quickly scrape clean this inner flange, this lower portion, and then I use my blunted trimming tool again, just to remove some clay from the outside. I want these to dry quickly, and generally speaking, that's always why I remove as much slip as I possibly can from the pot itself, as if you leave any portion of the pot covered in wet, sticky slip, it'll just take much longer to dry, especially in the constant cold and damp we get here in Britain. When I've run out of most of the space on my shelves, this is how I store the pots overnight, with plastic sheeting draped over a large board of polystyrene, just to keep the worst of the drafts from hitting the pots overnight, which could cause them to dry out unevenly. The next step is to flip every single pot over so that the undersides get a chance to dry. These lids needed another few hours to dry out, especially the bottoms, which are now the tops of the lids, where the clay is the thickest. Next up are the jars, which were actually almost ready to go, so I didn't need to flip them over onto their rims. I just carefully prized them off of the bat and placed them onto a new dry wearboard. Dry is helpful as it'll absorb some of the moisture from the bottoms of the pots, which are usually just a little bit softer than the upper sections of the walls. I then scrape away all the excess clay from the throwing bats, and I'll let you enjoy the rest of this process without any narration. This is always quite a satisfying moment in the studio, and all of this isn't waste. I can recycle it all, and as these pieces are so thin and will break down easily, I just chuck them straight into my reclaim bucket. Perhaps one of the most exciting things about working with porcelain again is that I finally get to use these tools made by Jaejun Lee, a fantastic Korean potter and toolmaker and friend. These have sharp tungsten carbide blades, and are even signed beautifully at the bottom. I have 2 different shapes, and they are incredibly sharp. They can be quite difficult to learn how to use, as not only does the clay need to be in the perfect condition, but you need to hold the blade at the right angle too, as otherwise they can be quite prone to chattering. But I've thoroughly enjoyed using them, and for trimming these jars, I'll be using a mixture of these and my bison turning tools, and I'll leave a link to Jaejun's work and website in the description below. I start trimming these by tap centering the lid. Once it's in the middle, I lock it down with 3 lumps of clay, which are pushed firmly into the lid. I spend the first few moments just tidying up the form, be it turning away a slight undulation on the rim, or running over this bottom edge on the outside of the lid. Essentially, I'm trying to make each plane as smooth and flat as possible, whilst also removing excess weight. You'll hear lots of blowing throughout this process, and that's simply me dislodging bits of clay from the tools themselves or from inside the lid. I trim a fair amount away from inside, and it's relatively tricky work, as all the pieces just accumulate in on themselves, either accumulating on the tool or even being compressed back into the porcelain. But anywhere I can feel a thickness where I don't want it, I'll just trim it away. I'll then skim over these smaller marks with a larger tool, which leaves a nicer surface on the porcelain. I then turn away that tiny amount of wiggle room I had, checking beforehand of course, to see how well the lid fit on the body, and to check I can just place the body down onto the lid. Once they fit, the pieces can switch positions. I brush some slip onto the base of the jar and then tap center it into place. And then, once it's running perfectly true, I seal the bottom with a plastic kidney, squashing some of the porcelain into the metal wheel head. And then the trimming can start. My aim is to make these so thin that the walls are almost translucent, which is entirely possible with porcelain, as you'll see in a little while. But this stuff really is a pleasure to trim. It's so smooth, there's no grog biting on the tool, and all my focus is on keeping my right hand and the blade as steady as possible, gnawing through any slight wobble in the pot. For the start of this process, I use my bison turning tool just because I'm more comfortable using it and have turned quite literally thousands of pots with it. Then I tested out Jaejun's, and they are lethal. All it would take is one error for the tool to catch and for you to gouge a big hole in the piece. And as time went by, I found myself using these tools to do the final skim of the outside or the much more detailed work, such as when I trim the indent at the top. Here's how I check how thin the walls are, a practice more commonly seen when turning wood on the lathe. If this were the normal stoneware, which I normally use, you wouldn't be able to see this whatsoever, unless it was absolutely wafer thin. But with porcelain, you can begin to see the light through it, when it's about 4 or 5 millimeters thick, but it's a very useful way of telling which areas need to be trimmed more or less. And you can see just how firmly I'm holding the tool by the white portion of my finger where all the blood has been squeezed out from. I then just did one last check with the light and then smoothed off the entire outside with the flat edge kidney once again. Next, it's the lid's turn to be trimmed, which I place in situ on the top, using the body of the jar like a chuck. And at this stage I'll trim the lid until it runs flush with the body below it. Throughout this process, my fingers on my left hand are pushing down really quite firmly, just to make sure it stays in place, as there is a tendency, with the pressure being pushed on the outside, for the lid to suddenly jump up or dislodge, and it's for that exact same reason that I'm only removing small strands at any one time, as if I were to try and remove it all in one go with the flat of the tool, there's a really high chance the tool would catch on the lid and something would go wrong. After the side of the lid has been trimmed flush, I'll move on to trimming the top section of the lid. In some cases, the thickness of the top of the lid might be too thin to use my fingers, so instead I push down using this spinner, which distributes the weight, much like lying down on thin ice, to prevent yourself from breaking through. I then remove the spinner and begin trimming the top. Here, my aim is to turn a concave surface. This is done specifically for the types of glazes I'll use, so that they can pull nicely into the hollow. And as I'm after a curved surface, I use a curved blade to trim this section. The closer I get to the middle, the thinner the clay is, so I do need to be careful not to remove too much from the centre, or push down too firmly, as it could quite easily deform the lid. Then, once most of the clay has been removed, I use a curved metal kidney to smooth out all of the turning lines. Or at least the worst of them anyway. These are handmade pots, after all, and I welcome the subtle maker's marks that remain. After the lid has been trimmed, I give it a quick burnish if it needs, and now I can trim the indent below, which is always something I do after the lid has been trimmed, as having a thicker portion of clay here helps to support the lid as it's being turned. And this is where Jaejun's turning tools really come into a class of their own. The edges are so fine and the tip comes to a point, and really they allow me to trim in such a way that my other turning tools simply can't do. Once the top's finished, I slide a knife beneath the pot, separating it from the metal wheelhead, and then very crucially, I scrape away excess clay so it doesn't embed into the lid when I place it back down. I quickly tap center it, although it's worth mentioning that at this stage I'm watching the base to see if that's centered, rather than the lid itself. Arguably, the base is the most difficult part to turn. The only thing that's holding it in place is the upward facing flange of the lid, so you'll notice that whenever I trim, I'm always pushing down with my left hand to keep the pot firmly in place, as without it, the pot would simply leap up. And finally, as I want a flat base, I use a flat blade to trim the bottom, although I do aim to trim the base ever so slightly concave, as I wouldn't want the highest point on the bottom to be the centre, as then it wouldn't sit flat, rather it might pivot or lean to one side. I stop trimming as soon as I feel any give in the base whatsoever, as I don't want it to be too thin and weak. These sharp tools leave a lovely surface on the porcelain though. With the stoneware I use, I almost always need to burnish it. And finally, I stamp in my maker's mark, the small runic F, which I hope doesn't need any explaining. We're not quite finished though yet. The last thing I do, once I've removed the body of the jar, is I just neaten up any rough surfaces or sharp edges on the lid, which is then carefully removed and delicately placed atop the jar. I haven't made lots of porcelain pieces yet, rather just a few small batches, test subjects, I suppose. It's going to be fascinating to see glazes on them, but in this simple state, perfectly crisp and white, they're also quite lovely too. Time will tell. The most enjoyable aspect of this process has been using these, the turning tools made by Jaejun Lee. It's amazing the difference it can make, and I should add that in no way is this a sponsored advert or anything. Rather, I'm a tool geek and a big fan of his work. Thanks so much for watching if you've made it this far, and I'll see you next week.